I was at an event at my dad's work and I was wandering around aimlessly looking for my parents. I could not find them anywhere. And suddenly some strange man stops me and he's like, "Hey, are you Shane's daughter?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Oh my gosh, I knew it. You look exactly like your dad." And I'm like, "Okay," because my dad is a big bald biker and I am in fact not big or bald, right? And he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Jason. I've been friends with your dad for years. I hear so much about you. I feel like I know you already." And I was like, "Okay, cool." And he's like, "Do you know where your parents are? Do you need me to help you find them? Because I'm pretty sure I know where they are." And I'm like, "Yes, please." And so I follow this man around until we turn a corner, and that's when I see them. My big genetic giveaway. Okay, I have these massive dimples and they're genetic, and standing right next to the person who gave them to me is my father, because I got them from my mother, and that is 100% how he knew who I was, because I look exactly like my mother. I actually could not look like my father at all unless I shaved my head bald, because I am his stepdaughter, not his biological daughter. But it is super cute to think about the fact that this guy has been friends with my dad for years and hears so much about me that he feels like he knows me, yet he never heard that I am his stepdaughter, not his biological daughter. Stepdad has one of those weird grandparent names, but nobody knows where it came from, because I call my stepdad dad. So when I gave birth for the first time 16 years ago, he was there. When they put my baby into his arms, I said, "Here, go see grandpa." Grandpa is what my kids were supposed to call my stepdad, but they call him Pocket. I don't know why they call him Pocket, but they have always called him Pocket, and he just has never bothered to correct them. It's always been Pocket. And now that my son is older, obviously now, I just said I gave birth 16 years ago. And so his friends all know my dad because he owns a quarter horse ranch and they all go out there to work whenever they need money, right? And it's just so funny to me because for some reason, everybody calls this man Pocket now. Not everybody, as in like his family all calls him Tiger, and then like me and my siblings call him Dad, and my mom called him Shane because his name is Shane. But my son's friends who all know him just call him Pocket. And so on Halloween, my parents were at my house and my son was having his friends over, and every time a new 16-year-old boy would walk in my house, they would look at my dad and they'd be like, "Oh, hey, Pocket." Like, why are you calling that man Pocket? His name is not Pocket. Got hit by a truck on Thursday, and I'm sure you're like, "Didn't your dad kill himself last year?" That was my other dad. That was the one I was assigned at birth. He was a fucking loser. So my mom got rid of him, and then she got remarried, and I have always called my stepdad dad since I was a kid. And then when I had my own children, they started calling my stepdad grandpa, and so that is their grandpa. I actually never allowed them to be exposed to my biological father because he was a terrible person. He was the kind of person who would kill himself to ruin his fifth ex-wife's day, okay? And when he did that, my stepdad called me, and he had this really heartfelt conversation with me about how he'll always be here for me. He's my real dad. That DNA doesn't matter. Yada, yada, yada. And then literally barely a year later, this motherfucker goes and gets ran down by a truck, okay? And so I am out of state when this happens. I have to fly back to Idaho, and I immediately go to the hospital, and I'm holding his hand, and I'm crying, and I'm talking to him, and he's not responding because he's on a ventilator. He's hooked up to dozens of machines. He has a ton of internal damage. I will not even allow my children to go up and see him in that state because it's so bad, okay? And I'm just crying and talking to him, and suddenly my phone pings, and it's my 16-year-old son, and he says, "Tell grandpa I say 6'7". And so I hold my dad's hand, and I'm like, "Ainsley says 6'7". And I shit you not, this man gets a smirk around his ventilator. He opens his eyes for the first time, then they roll to the back of his head, and he closes his eyes. He ignored all of my heartfelt comments, and then the man-child goes and smirks at a 6'7" joke. I got hit by a truck last week and he's on a ventilator, and I recently watched a video about how if somebody's on a ventilator or on life support, they can still hear you. Even if they're not coherent, if they're not alert, if their eyes aren't open, they can at least still hear you talking to them. So last night I was there visiting him. I was standing with him, holding his hand and talking to him while my mom was in the corner eating dinner. And I was just telling him about my day and what I'd done that day. So I was talking about how I went to work that morning, and then when I was on lunch, I went to the tow yard to try to get some stuff from his motorcycle, because he was on his motorcycle when he got hit. He was crossing an intersection and a truck was trying to speed through a flashing yellow turn and sped right into my father and totaled his bike. So it was at the tow yard, and I wanted to get his saddlebags, but the guy at the tow yard wouldn't give me his saddlebags because my dad had bolted them to his motorcycle. And so the guy at the tow yard was saying that that meant they were part of the bike, and I was like, "They're not part of the bike. I bought my dad those saddlebags for Christmas 2 years ago. He got the bike like 20 years ago. The math doesn't math there, buddy." And he still wouldn't give them to me. He said that since the bike was totaled, they now belong to the insurance company. And I wasn't in the mood to argue with him, even though I know I would have won if I would have argued with him, okay? So I started emptying out the saddlebags. I took all of that. I took his lunch pail. And when I opened his lunch pail, I discovered this man had tuna fish for lunch the day he got hit by a truck. And so it had been roasting in his lunch pail for the last 5 days in 105-degree heat. Absolutely disgusting. I had to completely clean all of that out. And then I went to the local Mexican place and I picked up dinner for me and my mom. And then I went home and I packed it into my dad's lunch pail because I thought it would be cute if I brought it to her in my dad's lunch pail. And while I'm going on and on yapping about this stuff, the nurses come in so that they can move my dad around, because something about pressure, and I know when they do this, it causes him extreme pain because his eyes shoot open. It's like the only time his eyes are open. And so my mom gets up and she runs over so she can be by his side when his eyes open. And when it happens, she rubs his hand and she's like, "Hey baby, have you been enjoying listening to Cassidy talk?" And my dad looks at her and then he looks at me and then he looked back at her and he shook his head no. And that's how I know that my dad escaped that wreck without any brain damage. Actually 0 for 2 on dads. My biological dad killed himself last year because he got mad at his wife and he was trying to hurt her feelings and ruin her day or whatever. And then my stepdad, who is actually who raised me, and that's who I've called dad for the majority of my life, he was like, "Oh, don't worry about him. He was never your real dad. I was always your real dad, regardless of what DNA says, and you'll always still have me." And then a fucking year later, this dude gets hit by a truck and he's been on a ventilator for the last 9 days. And I did not let my kids go to see him because my dad was a great grandpa. He was a proud grandpa. He was a great dad, but like he lived to be a grandpa. That was his thing. That's the thing he was most proud of. And he would not want my children to see him the way that he was. He looked like he had been hit by a truck because he was hit by a fucking truck, right? And so I chose to let their last memories of him not be him fighting for his life. And so now my children's last memories of my dad, their last interaction with him, was the day before he got hit by the truck. And my sons and I and my mother were actually in Vegas at the time. My mom was in our room and she was laying on the hotel bed next to my son, who was sitting there playing on his phone, and my mom's phone started ringing. It was my dad, and she answered it and she was like, "Hey baby." And then her and my dad start like grossly flirting because my parents are still grossly in love. We're still grossly in love. And so they're like sitting there grossly flirting on the phone while both of my kids are sitting right next to my mom. And my older son looks at me and just mouths the word ew. And my younger son is like fake gagging. And so their last memories of my dad are how much he loved their grandmother. I was just killed by a truck driver who didn't understand when and why to yield for bikers. So I'm going to explain this scenario for you so anybody who doesn't know and doesn't understand can learn, because maybe if more people know and more people understand this, less people will have dead dads because of it. So the scenario for my dad's case here is that my dad was passing straight through an intersection and there was a guy in a truck who was trying to turn on a flashing yellow in that intersection. Now, my dad's light turned yellow, but at that intersection, my dad, the speed on that road was 55 miles per hour. So something to keep in mind is, per the law, if you can stop safely at a yellow, you should stop safely at that yellow. If you're on a motorcycle and you are going over 25 miles per hour and that light turns yellow, you cannot stop safely at that yellow, because you can't abruptly stop on a motorcycle and it be safe. You're putting your life at risk if you do that, especially if you are being tailgated. So if you are waiting at a flashing yellow to turn and you see a motorcyclist coming and they're on a yellow, there is a high chance they are not stopping for the yellow. And it's not because they're a speed demon. It's not because they're trying to race the yellow. It's because it is not safe for them to abruptly stop their bike at the speed they're going to hit that, to miss that yellow, to stop for that yellow, okay? So your job with your flashing yellow light is to yield for that oncoming traffic. Do not go because the biker cannot stop. As a kid, my mom had this friend who would buy her a box of chocolate-covered cherries every single Christmas. Every single Christmas, my mother would open this box of chocolate-covered cherries with the biggest smile on her face, and she would be like, "I'm so excited to eat these after dinner tonight." And then she would put them away, and after dinner, she would pull them back out, and she would give them to me and my siblings because my mother hated chocolate-covered cherries. And this went on for a very long time, and finally, after like 7 years of it, I asked my mom, "Why do you not just tell her you don't like chocolate-covered cherries so that she can stop buying them for you?" And my mom explained to me that her friend came to her right after her father had passed away, and she was having a meltdown because it was right around Christmas time, and she always bought her father a box of chocolate covered cherries for Christmas, and now she had nobody to buy these chocolate covered cherries for anymore. What was she going to do? Because she couldn't buy chocolate covered cherries. And so my mom lied and pretended that she liked chocolate covered cherries so her friend would have somebody to buy those cherries for, so that she didn't have to break her tradition, so that she didn't get sad every year around Christmas time when she couldn't buy the chocolate covered cherries. And I remember thinking that was so silly because why did she need an excuse or a reason to buy these chocolate covered cherries? And then on Sunday, my dad got killed. And last night, I went to go buy a box of chips for my pantry. And I always buy the same box of variety pack chips because my kids like 4 of the 5 bags of chips that are in there. And I am so against food waste, but it's okay because the 5th bag of chips is Fritos, which is my dad's favorite type of chip. And so I would always just bag them up and I would give them to my mother, and my mother would pack them in my dad's lunch every single day so that they didn't go to waste. But now my dad is gone and I have gone full circle and turned into the chocolate cherry lady. My dad was killed, we were sent flowers galore. And by flowers galore, I mean that it took 5 cars to transport the flowers that were sent to his funeral from the funeral home to my mother's house. All of those flowers did not fit in her house, so all of the larger floral arrangements had to be left on the front porch. And it made it extremely obvious that somebody who lived there had just passed away. And so the day after his funeral, I get on Facebook and I have a message from somebody I've never seen before in my life. I open the message and I read it, and basically what it's saying is that it's a girl who lives with her parents in the house next door to my parents' house, and that they saw all the flowers on the porch and they Googled my dad's name and they found out that my dad had just passed away. And then they used Google Translate on the obituary to find me, his daughter, so she could message me and reach out because they knew my dad and they knew that my mom didn't speak Spanish and they don't speak English, but they wanted to send their condolences and they wanted to see if they could bring my mother over some food. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And so ever since that day, they've been regularly bringing my mother plates of food and communicating with her using Google Translate because of the language barrier. And I'm telling you this story about how compassionate some people can be because it has been 3 weeks and 4 days since my father was killed, and these strangers are still regularly bringing my mother food plates, and the guy who killed him has yet to say a single word to me. Dad never wanted biological children because he came from an FLDS family, a generational FLDS family. If you don't know what FLDS is, it's like a fundamentalist, incestuous, polygamous cult, basically. And on his biological dad's side, they were one of the founding families for the specific group that they came from. And so they had been partaking in these family activities for literal generations. It was to the point that his grandparents on that side were uncle and niece and related in 3 other ways. It was getting very the hills have eyes over on that family line. Luckily for my dad, though, my grandma took him and she escaped when he was just a few days old. She married somebody outside of the cult. That's who she raised my dad with. But my dad always knew who his biological father was and what they were doing in that family, which was each other, obviously. And so he knew from a very young age that he was never going to have biological kids. But the thing my dad wanted more than anything in this life was to be a father, was to have a family. And so the way he was able to accomplish that was to marry a single mother with kids and then to raise her children. But I never knew how my parents met until I was like maybe 19 or 20 years old. And I needed new brakes on my car, and my dad had this friend with an upholstery shop who could also do car work, and he was like, oh, take your car out there and Hector will fix it up for you. And so I get there and I get out of the car and Hector's like, oh man, this brings up old memories. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he told me that back in the day he was standing out there with my dad one day and they saw my mom walk into the shop next door, and my dad looked at my mom with my little brother and no ring, and then looked at Hector and said, that's gonna be my wife one day. And sure enough, he scooped that lady up, he married her, and then he was a father to all 3 of her children. My dad was on a ventilator. I was making videos telling stories about what was going on and chronicling the experience because I thought it would be funny when he woke up and he could go back onto my TikTok and he could watch all of those videos to see what was going on because he was on so many pain meds. I did not think that he would be able to remember what was happening during that period of time after he was weaned off of those. I did not think that my father was going to pass away. At that moment in time when I was making those videos, I thought that my dad was going to live. I thought that because my dad was so responsive and reactive, there was no way he was going to die. I could talk to him and he could answer my questions with shaking his head yes or no. I could say, hey, move your left foot, and he would move his left foot. I would say, hey, squeeze my hand, and he would squeeze my hand. He was still in his head, and because of that, I genuinely did not think he was going to die. I thought that regardless of the fact that I knew all of his organs were shutting down and slowly killing him, I thought that because he was still in his head, he was going to pull through somehow. Obviously, that's not what happened, but during that period of time, I made this one specific video about how I went to the hospital after a really long day, and I was just dumping on him, complaining about how awful my day was, as if he wasn't just laying there, a hostage, listening to me on a ventilator because he had been hit by a truck. And when I was done, my mom walked up and she was like, hey, baby, have you been enjoying listening to Cassidy talk? And my dad shook his head no. And it went viral back when I posted it, but it went viral again last night. And a lot of people who were commenting on it didn't realize that my dad had passed away since then. And somebody somebody else went through and responded to every single comment telling them that my dad died. Just copy and pasted, oh, her dad died already, to every single comment over 200 times. So I woke up this morning to my comment section flooded with comments that said my dad died. I opened my eyes and the first thing I saw was 200 something comments of somebody saying my dad died over and over and over again. So anyway, that's how my day started off. What about you? I had my son so young. We lived with my parents for the first couple of years of his life, and when we did move out of their house, we actually got a house 10 houses away from theirs. So my son has always been extremely close to my parents because they've always been a huge part of his life. They've always been extremely active in his life, and when it came to my dad specifically, he was always one of the boys. He was always wanting to do the kid shit with the kids, okay? So when my son became a teenager and he wanted to start hanging out with his friends more, no big deal for my dad whatsoever, because he would just hang out with them too. And so like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, my dad started this tradition accidentally where he would take my son and his friends to Haunted World every year. Haunted World is like this spooky haunted corn maze where I live that happens in September and October. And so for the first weekend that it opens up every single year, all the boys would meet at my house. My dad would come out here and he would pick them all up and he would take them to Haunted World, where my father, a 50-something-year-old man, would go running around with all these teenage boys away from people chasing them through a corn maze with like hatchets and chainsaws and shit, okay? And so because my dad did this type of stuff with my son and all his friends, they all became really close to my dad, and they all called him Pocket because that's what my son called him. I have no idea why my kids called my dad Pocket, but at this point, everybody calls my dad Pocket. And in June, my dad was hit and killed by a negligent truck driver. And when this happened, my son and his friends all went to my dad's funeral in Harley shirts in his honor because he was a big biker. Anyway, here's a photo of the boys who have to go to Haunted World this year without Pocket because some guy decided to not make any attempts to yield at a flashing yellow turn.